Well, week one was a big one, wasn't it? Well, hopefully from now on you'll be more used to the systems, you'll be able to understand how to get information and how to proceed with the course. So, Module 2, we're looking at the history and structure of the Australian legal system. And this may strike you as maybe a bit boring. You may not be the biggest fan of history, but it's actually very important, and let me tell you why. We are going through one of the most extensive periods of change in the law, let alone in other aspects of life. And to understand what those changes mean, to understand where we're going, we need to understand where we came from. So this is the foundation of understanding the way, all those basic tools for understanding how the law works and how legal knowledge is formed, and also to understand what needs to be changed, how it needs to be changed, how we're going to do it in a way that's responsible. So a lot of the discussion in the text is about the Australian constitutional structure. It's a federal structure, and you should know what a federal structure means. And it creates a very interesting kind of network of regulation based around the different states and the federal jurisdiction that you don't necessarily get in other countries. For instance, the United Kingdom doesn't have that particular issue. So you have various levels of government with different areas of responsibility as defined by their different constitutions. And some of that is sort of historical. Some of that is more historical accident. And look, when you do constitutional law, you'll pick up a lot more of this. But even something simple like income tax that we've always, through my lifetime, I've always seen as part of what the federal government does, originally was something the state governments did. So we've seen a very an escalating series of changes from when the federal government originally was just going to be kind of a sort of a capstone, and the states were going to be the main form of government in Australia, to the situation now where the federal government has a lot more power. Not to mention the rise of local government, which was not even considered at the time of the Constitution. So you need to understand how those structures work and how things fit together. We also talk a little bit about Indigenous law, and we come to the realisation that Indigenous law isn't something that's recognised at the whim of the Australian government. It's not something that's, we do because we want to be nice to recognise, but that Indigenous law has its own status. That Indigenous law preceded the Western legal system, and under the rules of international law, there are very, very specific guidelines as to what happens when you conquer a new country and what happens to the existing legal system, and it doesn't just disappear overnight. And there are rules as to how those systems work together. So that's something that's interesting as well, and it certainly is something that there's a good coverage of in the text. And that's, again, like most things in this course, it's going to be a flavour for things that we'll discuss in later subjects. The other key concept I want to make sure that we focus on is the doctrine of separation of powers. And that's the separation of three forms of power. The legislature, who are the people who make the laws, the executive, who are those who implement the laws, and the judiciary, who oversee the laws. Now, this is very important in our political system, because this is how we try and stop corruption occurring. This is how we stop one limb of government from stockpiling all the power. And of very particular importance here is the role of the judiciary and judicial oversight of the other forms of government. There's a bit of sort of mix and match between the legislature and the executive. For instance, a minister of government is a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate. So they're a member of the legislature, but they're also the head of the executive, which is the bureaucracy that goes out and implements the laws. So there's some allowance of overlap there. However, the judicial section of government is always kept separate, and that's because it is so important that the judiciary be kept independent and have the ability to call the government up when the government or the legislature steps over the line and exceeds their power under the Constitution. This is all part of the bigger picture of the concept of rule of law, and we'll talk again about that in more depth. But the idea of rule of law is that law creates a fair, accessible playing field, or we aspire for it to be fair. We try and work for it to be fair, but it creates a fair playing field for engagement and for oversight of power. Before we had the concept of rule of law, basically kings and tyrants could do whatever they wanted, and they said, we have the power, we'll do whatever we want. The idea of rule of law was to say that there has to be a structure, there has to be a legal structure through which those kings and tyrants and so on operate to somehow moderate that power to protect people. And rule of law is absolutely central to the protection of democracy. And that's another topic that's something we need to think about more as we evolve as lawyers, is what does democracy actually mean? Unfortunately, the media often reduces democracy to this kind of majoritarianism, sort of mob rule, that if most people want something, that's democratic. And that's clearly not true, because a democracy exists to balance a whole series of different interests, different groups, different individuals. And it's not just simply a matter of saying the biggest group of bullies wins. And if you can get 70% of people to hate the other 30% of people, therefore the 70% must always be right. That's not what a democracy is about. So rule of law has a very, very important role in protecting democracy, and not in being something that moderates the power of government to mobilise that kind of populism and that kind of fear and ignorance, and the power of media and corporations as well to access that. And you'll see there's often a role for lawyers in that public professional life in protecting the minorities, protecting the powerless from the more powerful. There's a quote from Shakespeare that's very often used in completely the wrong context. And that's the quote that the first thing we'll do, let's kill all the lawyers. And a lot of kind of ignorant anti-lawyer people use this as proof that Shakespeare hated lawyers. But in fact, when you look in context, this comes from Henry VI Part 2. And the person who says it, someone charmingly named Dick the Butcher, is talking about overthrowing government. And his statement is, the way to implement tyranny, the first thing we do is we kill all the lawyers. So that's something to think about, and that's something to think about when looking at our history and looking forward, and looking at your own role as not just a professional, not just someone whose job it is to be a lawyer, but someone who is the guardian of public law, the guardian of rule of law, and someone who has an important role in protecting democracy.